discussed can literally be
in the intro.
pre-roll. So,
Welcome back, everybody.
welcome back. Ooh, welcome back.
Welcome back to the podcast. Today is October 26th. I'm Adam,
And I'm Brett.
and it is 11 days until the midterms.
Wow, how did we get here? I'm not entirely sure.
Less than a week and a half, everybody.
But for this episode, because we are so close, we're going to take you on a special journey across the country, going from state to state, talking about the Senate races,
Coast to coast.
the House races,
Brett and Adam do manifest destiny in 1 hour.
and the gubernatorial races.
Oh, yeah.
We are joined this week by a friend of ours, Nicholas Eberly, who you're going to hear from in a minute. But before we get to all the fun stuff,
Got some housekeeping for you guys.
yeah, so the 36%, we've grown here over the past 6 weeks.
And spent money.
Oh, yeah. You can now officially find us anywhere you listen to podcasts.
Literally anywhere. You name it, we're there.
That includes iTunes, Spotify, Podbean, YouTube, elsewhere, I'm sure.
Other things.
Yeah,
They're
we'll
there.
get there eventually.
Also, real quick, shout out to all of our international listeners.
Oh, yeah, all of you. We got some audience in Sweden.
Sweden and the United Kingdom. If we could
Yeah.
branch out, my goal by the end of this time we're doing this is to get listeners in Nauru,
Okay.
small little South Pacific island.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of Nauru.
Me too. Nauru is a great country.
So,
Also Bhutan.
And Bhutan.
I love Bhutan.
So, make sure after you get done listening to this podcast, you go and follow us at the 36 Podcast on Twitter.
Yep. And also like and subscribe on all of the places by which you find your podcast. Like us, download the episode, listen to it. Your stats help us. They get us better, in the ratings. They, not to mention, and also tell your friends.
Yeah,
Tell your friends.
we're trying to spread democracy here.
Yes,
people.
exactly.
We need you to
Democracy,
help us.
as the Washington Post constantly reminds us, dies in the dark. And as we all learned from the third episode of Star Wars, we don't want this ending in a loud, thunder of clapping. We want to not end democracy and win.
So, without further ado, let's get into it.
Let's get into it. Hey, Brett.
Hey, Adam.
Brett, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
Is there currently a giveaway for avian apparel stickers?
You know, Adam, I'm not sure if there is or not. Why don't you tell me about where that would possibly be if there is one?
Well, announcing right now in a world premiere, the Avian Apparel 36% giveaway.
Oh my God.
We're giving away stickers, fam. Avian Apparel stickers. How you get that? Well, how you do that is exactly by following the 36% with Brett and Adam on Twitter at the 36 Podcast. And then you got to head on over to Instagram or stay on Twitter. And you type in at My Avian Apparel and follow them as well. Once you follow the both of them, you will be entered in to win Avian Apparel stickers.
Wow, that sounds like quite the deal, Adam.
Oh,
Can
yeah.
you run that down? Can you shorten that down? Can you give me the 10-second rundown?
I can. You follow the 36%. You follow Avian. You do it. You win, possibly. We will be announcing this on election night, November 6th. So you go vote. You get your I voted sticker. And then maybe that night you will win my Avian stickers.
Oh my goodness gracious. Adam, that sounds like quite the deal. This is
Yes.
a some dollar price amount giveaway sponsored through the 36%.
You're dang right. You're dang
Wow.
right. We're just,
And you thought we were just a couple of poor college kids, but no, we want to give it back to the people, to
We are
you,
just-
the listeners.
redistributing the wealth.
Exactly. Good little socialists we are.
Alrighty.
Cool, yeah, end of ad.
And that.
1, 2, 3, 3, 2, 1.
Perfect. Okay, so welcome to the pod, everybody. This week's special episode, we're going to be talking about midterm elections. So, as per usual, I'm Brett,
And I'm Adam.
and this week we have a special guest. We're joined by Mr. Nick Eberly. Nick, you want to say hi?
Hello.
Tell us a little bit about yourself, Nick.
Well, I am a senior political science student at Truman State University. I'm from St. Louis, Missouri. I'm probably the biggest elections nerd on this campus.
Ooh,
That might be a bold claim, yeah.
that's true, though.
Uh,
I believe
the I make political election maps for fun.
Just for fun?
Yeah, for fun. I guess we'll go with that.
Yeah. Roughly how many campaigns have you worked on in your lifetime?
I was paid to work on one campaign. It was a special election in this great state, down in the Lead Belt in Iron County for House District 144, in which that was like a Trump plus 50 seat, I believe. And working for the Democrat, we lost by 6 points. So not...
44-point swing is not something to shake your fist at.
Yeah, so it could have, it would have been nice to win, but I have no...
It always is.
In 2018, sometimes you have to celebrate getting close.
I mean, I don't really know what winning is like, having voted for the first time in 2014 and then 2016. So I've heard it's good.
Yeah.
Possibly. It might be on our horizon pretty soon. But that's what we're going to talk about today,
that kind
everybody.
of nicely transitions into what's coming up here in, 11 days? Today being...
No, 10 days.
Today's
Everyone,
October
it is
26th.
10 days until the election. There's 10 days, 21 hours, and 2 minutes.
So, we have roughly rounding up to 11 days until Election Day. Obviously, we've talked about a lot of the Democrats taking back the House, possibly the Senate. Obviously, this is the midterm, so this is our big referendum on the presidency, quote unquote. But what does that actually look like, and what's it going to take? So, starting with what all the pollsters are probably considering a bigger uphill battle for the Democrats, we're going to look to the Senate.
Yes. So a major aspect of what we want to look for in regards to the Senate is what we're calling the Big Five, which are the states of Missouri, Nevada, Arizona, Florida, and Indiana. So,
why are these the Big Five? Why do we care about
yes.
these?
Nick?
I believe these are the 5 races rated as toss-up by the Cook Political Report.
No, that's, yeah. These
No,
are...
exactly. Like, why are these important?
So,
Yeah.
okay, so 3 of these 5 are Democratic-held seats, 2 in the Midwest and 1 in Florida, and the other 2 are Sun Belt states that Republicans hold, 1 with an incumbent and the other that is an open seat, left open by the cowardly withdrawal of Jeff Flake from public life.
So also looking at all of these states, I mean, Missouri is kind of, it's gone back and forth between red and blue. Indiana kind of in the same boat. But right now, didn't all these states go to Trump in 2016?
Not Nevada.
Yeah, Nevada went blue.
Okay.
Clinton won Nevada by 2.5 points.
Okay. So, I mean, still not overly convincingly blue, but... it's still blue. So it's I don't know. What are we seeing in these races? Are we seeing Democrats running against just Trump lights because Trump has been successful in a lot of these places, or what's the kind of dynamic here? Obviously, they're all toss-ups, but
So I think it might be useful to start with the race that we all have intimate knowledge of, which is of Claire McCaskill's re-election battle against Missouri Attorney General Josh Hawley.
The latter.
tell us about it.
Well, from what public polling there has been in the race, which there hasn't been a ton, honestly, is basically every poll's been a tie all the way through. And you hear from the Republicans and the Democrats, you hear about internal polling. Like, that's, like, you might as well have just made that up.
Right.
Like, you know.
You send a couple interns around the DNC headquarters with a clipboard saying, "Who are you going to vote for this
Yeah.
time?"
So it's probably going to be, if not the closest, one of the closest races. And for those who might not have been following politics in 2012, Claire McCaskill was considered dead on arrival for her re-election then. She had won in 2006 in an upset over Jim Talent. I don't know how much political history interests anyone here. You know, politics began when Trump was elected president.
Yeah.
You know, nothing happened.
No one gave a shit
There
about
was
it before
nothing
then.
before then.
Yeah.
So,
George
however,
Washington,
the famous turn in 2012 was Todd Akin, her Republican opponent, who was a congressman representing the St. Louis suburbs. In fact, Ann Wagner's in that seat now.
Ew.
Made his famous legitimate rape comment, in which on the Jacob Report on Fox 2 News said that rape, I believe, was the will of God, and that, or that not that rape was the will of God. I guess I'm butchering his words here. Like he
Don't want to put words in his mouth.
that he
here.
as
Come
well did butcher his own words, I guess.
on. His comment was something along the lines of like, if it really is rape, then a woman's body has like ways of shutting that.
Yeah.
down.
If it was a legitimate rape, a woman's body can shut down.
Right.
I'm jumping, I guess, ahead to Indiana, where I believe
Oh.
that in that race in 2012 there was also a similar comment. But anyway, back to Missouri.
It shocks me, and it's sticking on that point in 2012. We have stories like that from 2012. There are other political scandals you look back where someone makes these really incendiary comments and then their campaign is over. I don't know if those rules would still apply here in 2018.
So 2012 was the war on women.
Right.
That was very strongly pushed by the Obama campaign was that the Republicans were waging a war on women, and it was a successful
Yeah, they did
plot
really
by
well.
the Democrats. Claire McCaskill is probably the luckiest statewide office holder in the entire country in terms of the races she's won.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe Doug Jones can
See, I was
claim.
thinking Heidi Heitkamp.
Heidi. We'll get to North Dakota later, I assume. But
Yes.
Heitkamp might challenge her for that. But like,
I think that plays into a bigger theme of why do we have to keep getting lucky? Why can't we just win races?
well, in many ways, Claire McCaskill makes her own luck, which
Right.
is in 2012 she spent money attacking Todd Akin during the Republican primary as too conservative. And these ads are widely credited with driving Todd Akin over the finish line in the primary. And so she essentially chose her own opponent.
Yeah. In the
so-
legal way, unlike Nixon.
Yeah.
Legal way. Yeah, so that was 2012. Claire hasn't had an election since, obviously. And now here we are in 2018. She's going up against Josh Hawley. It's amazing to me. I mean, I'm from Kansas. Kansas never makes national headlines unless it's something really bad. Missouri, you guys get a little more notoriety from time to time. But I've seen so much about Josh Hawley in headlines over the past couple weeks and his involvement with this lawsuit to take away coverage for pre-existing conditions for people. Obviously, this has been the narrative that I think McCaskill's camp really chose to drive home of saying, we're going to focus on this. It's forced him on the defensive to say, no, I have, I think it's like his son or something has like pre-existing conditions. There was a whole ad thing about it.
Who
And it's like,
cares? Womp womp.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, that should be our response to it. It's hilarious to me that, like, they're taking that approach and then on their heels at the same time, it's like you're intimately involved in this lawsuit. I think it's great from McCaskill's camp that she has the connections to make this a New York Times headline.
Yeah, I think that a lot of the Senate debates and the gubernatorial debates recently have really shown how crazy the Republicans are that are running. Like the Senate or the gubernatorial race down in Florida between Gillum and DeSantis.
Yeah.
Gillum did an amazing job in making the case that he was obviously the better candidate and that DeSantis, aka suntan, like not orange, Trump light, is absolutely crazy and funded and supported by racists.
Yeah.
So yeah, I hope we'll get to talk a little bit more about Florida's governor's race later.
Oh, we
But
will, don't you worry.
I think what perplexed me most about this Missouri Senate race is I feel like no one cares. Like in terms of like local media coverage of this race, compared to 2012, at least in my recollection, is very low.
Yeah.
And I thought this was going to be the marquee race in the country at the beginning of the cycle, but it's not even in the top 3 in the most like spent races for Senate right now.
No.
Like the top 3, I believe, are like Nevada, Florida, and Indiana. Maybe I think those are the top 3.
For Senate?
Yeah, because
I would buy that. I
because
don't really
Braun
know.
has so much money
Yeah.
of his own that he's put in.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
and Scott also in Florida.
Yeah.
So I guess that's another dynamic of a couple of these races is in Florida, the Republican governor, Rick Scott, Serpent Man, is
Voldemort light.
taking on incumbent Senator Nelson. Rick Nelson? Yeah, Rick Nelson.
Bill Nelson.
Bill Nelson, sorry.
Rick Scott, Bill Nelson.
This is confusing to me. At one point, there were multiple Democratic senators with the last name Nelson,
Yeah.
one from Florida and one from Nebraska, and both up in the same year. So
wow.
this
Nebraska
is
went blue.
Yeah.
the Republicans picked up that seat in 2012 when Nelson retired. So Deb Fisher is in that seat. In a couple of these races in Florida and Indiana, because the Republican in Indiana, Braun, who's running against Donnelly, is also a wealthy businessman
Yeah.
and both have kind of funneled a large amount of money into their own campaigns. Scott has spent an insane amount of money on his own campaign, which is currently, if public polling is to be believed, floundering because he made the classic campaign mistake of spending all of his money in the summer when no one cares,
Yep.
and then not having resources in the fall.
Yeah.
Just ground sliding
Currently 538 has Bill Nelson with a shared vote of like 51.5%, and Rick Scott with 48.5. So things are looking good there.
And this exact same thing happened in 2012. Like it's almost like this is the same Senate map as 2012, obviously the same third of the Senate, but it's like all these same races are being recapitulated. In Florida in 2012, the Republicans thought they were going to take down Bill Nelson as well, and the race looked close during the summer, and then Bill Nelson ended up with a wide lead going into the fall, which is exactly what happened here again.
I think it's, and we'll finish up in Missouri here in a minute, but we talked about a lot of these races. Missouri's not even in the top 3 for as much money raised or spent. This Senate race is still, like, both camps have raised well over $1 million. which is a threshold that we really didn't see surpassed that much before 2014. So now the new theme of Senate races or statewide races in general, because the gubernatorialship's included in this, is you're going to have to raise a lot of money. It's interesting to me that with all this money, it really seems that Democrats across the board are really just running on healthcare as an issue. Mm-hmm. And maybe this is completely unfounded, but I feel like if we are raising all this money, why aren't we doing more micro-targeting with our messages, actually telling people, not to say that healthcare isn't an appropriate message to be talking about with everybody. Everyone needs healthcare. Everyone needs to be able to afford their healthcare. But I don't know. I'm afraid that our message is almost a little too bland of we need to protect Obamacare. We need to stop the Republicans from taking away your health care. What if that doesn't translate in 2 weeks to votes? What if people are still just like, yeah, we should do that, but let's put a Republican in there who's willing to do that? Is that a fear that we have going into the next 2 weeks in any of these races?
Well, like what the current polling suggests on like issue polling, which believe issue polling, don't believe issue polling, is that the Democrats hold like a 20-point lead on the healthcare issue.
Okay.
Which is a stark reversal from
From like
the Obama
years
years.
ago.
Yeah, 2012, when they all got kicked out because of the healthcare issue.
I was gonna say when Democrats, ran against Obamacare.
Yeah. So that's actually the big difference. So like the parallel election to this one really is 2010,
Okay.
the Obama's first midterm. And the big difference here is in 2010, Democratic incumbents, you also had a bunch of people retiring in the House and stuff, but Democratic incumbents like would not appear with Obama. They distanced themselves from Obama or whatever. This election, we're not seeing that as much. Now, in certain races, yes, but there's a lot more candidates like Dean Heller in Nevada and Mick Sally in Arizona who, despite Trump not being particularly popular in those states and having performed poorly in those states, he did win Arizona, but by a diminished margin from what would be expected from a Republican. They are appearing with him, campaigning with him. He's tweeting about those races, and that's not something we saw in 2010.
Mm-hmm.
So they're scared about some of these seats. Again, we gave you the 5: Missouri, Nevada, Arizona, Florida, Indiana. I think we've managed to touch on all of those, but moving down the list, what's the next race that kind of sticks out?
I think to quickly cover why these big 5 really matter is that Democrats have to win every single one of these big 5, and then at least one of the current seats that we mentioned earlier, Tennessee, Texas, or
North Dakota.
Yeah.
And currently, as polling looks, North Dakota is the closest one that we have a chance of taking, but currently the polling doesn't look great. The voter suppression that North Dakota has recently engaged in with diminishing the amount of Native Americans that can vote because of changing laws about like P.O. boxes and voter registration in that regards. That one is looking worse and worse. So, Nick, talk to us. Which one of those do you think we have the best chance of winning in? Why does it matter to us, and what should we do about it?
So I want to say that the race that I think we have the best chance of winning in, and the polls would not tell you this, is Texas.
Yes.
And
I agree.
so I believe the polls in Texas in that showing Cruz has like a high single-digit lead with the likely voter models that they're using.
Yeah.
So Beto O'Rourke cannot win. Beto O'Rourke, congressman from El Paso, who has run an electrifying campaign against Ted Cruz down in Texas and raised a frankly insane amount of money.
To quickly go over these numbers, in individual contributions, Beto O'Rourke has raised $70 million, and Ted Cruz has raised in individual contributions $24 million.
Both of those numbers are crazy. But the fact that he's almost raised $100 million for a Senate race.
I believe I saw a tweet this morning talking about, because we have like 10-day out FEC reports or whatever, 15-day, I can't remember exactly what it is. Yeah. Like Heidi Heitkamp has raised like $14 million since like the beginning of October.
Yeah.
Like, so money is flowing into these races. And when we're talking about money raised, this is for the campaign committees. Ted Cruz is benefiting a lot from outside spending from PACs. So he is not being outspent necessarily to the regard that number would make you think.
Yeah, and it also really shows the dependency upon like dark money and super PACs that the Republican Party really holds on to, that the Democratic Party doesn't rely on as much. And I think that this draws back to what we saw back in 2016 with Bernie's campaign, in which he raised millions of dollars in simple individual contributions and not relying on super PACs. And that is very present, and this is the case in a lot of these races, is that Democrats in individual contributions will account for 75% of all individual contributions. However, in regards to money spent, most Republicans rely on super PACs.
Yeah. I mean, I think if nothing else, the individual contribution limits, though, again, as you mentioned, Nick, it doesn't necessarily translate into money spent. It definitely shows that individual people are willing to support an election over, you know, if we have dark money coming in, if we have PACs coming in, that can be money coming from anywhere spent on behalf of a person, as opposed to someone saying, I believe in this, here's $5 that I can spare.
Just one final thing on kind of campaign spending. Campaign money spent by a campaign committee goes a lot further than campaign money spent by an outside group. The reason for this, especially when it comes to TV ads, is that campaign committees receive a premium rate on TV ads. This is kind of in the weeds thing. But if you're wondering why are Republicans spending $4 million here on ads in a House race in Virginia, it's because the Congressional Leadership Fund, which is the Republican super PAC aligned with Paul Ryan, our glorious Speaker of the House, has to spend more to get a smaller amount of ads.
Yeah.
So that's why they have to spend so much in outside money. So back to Texas, though, with Beto.
Yeah.
Beautiful Beto. Beto O'Rourke cannot win with a regular Texas electorate, which is what the likely voter models are showing. He can come closer than any Democrat has since 2002, which was the last competitive race in Texas. But he can only win by fundamentally changing the Texas electorate and by bringing out many new voters and infrequent voters. Yep. And so far, it's not clear that is happening, but it could. So that's why of these three, like North Dakota, I think Heidi Heitkamp has kind of botched some parts of her campaign. She had this ad that came out that identified some anonymous sexual assault victims. It didn't get a lot of coverage outside of North Dakota, but it's kind of something like that has hurt her credibility there.
Yeah, I mean, she needs the coverage in North Dakota.
Yes, and Tennessee could surprise us on election night, but it's just such a steep hill to climb for a Democrat. And Phil Bredesen is a credible nominee. He was a very popular former governor from the 2000s, the early aughts, as I believe they're called. But
early aughts.
When Democrats have run candidates like him in races, they did a couple in 2016, Evan Bayh in Indiana, Ted Strickland in Ohio. They got a lot of excitement to begin with and then ended up crashing out by election day, kind of embarrassing performances. Yeah. So Tennessee could go, but I think Texas is the most likely. But I don't think any of them are likely. And this comes to kind of, not to spring this on you, but what I think the most likely outcome for the Senate is, and I think it's a 50-50 Senate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which, I'm not sure, can you tell me, are you familiar with what happens when there's a 50-50 Senate?
The great former governor of Indiana would become the 51st vote to push over every Republican legislation.
Yes. However, and Brett might be more familiar with this, having worked in the Missouri Senate with me, interned there. How much business in a Senate requires like unanimous consent or requires that there not be objection?
Quite a bit, I would say.
Yes.
Quite a bit.
We have had a 50-50 Senate before in the recent past. In 2001, before Jim Jeffords was driven out of the Republican Party, giving Democrats control. But what happened with the 50-50 Senate is that the Democrats and Republicans had to enter into a power-sharing agreement. And this is something that I think would have to happen now, because in any scenario in a 50-50 Senate, Democrats could block anything requiring the vice president's presence.
Well, I think even, let's say we get to 50-50. Let's say we somehow magically get there, because
It would just be a net of one seat, which I think is doable. More than a net of two.
Yeah, and I'll give you that. Even getting there, we don't have a cohesive Democratic Party in the Senate right now. We've seen this at just about every major battle. We have time and time again people that will side with the Republicans, and I'm not saying that inherently makes them bad actors or that's a bad thing for them to do. I think bipartisanship is something we genuinely need. However, I think getting to 50-50 doesn't necessarily solve a lot of our problems. I think it creates the opportunity to slow a lot of things down, which is good, slowing a lot of the bad things down. But even then, I think we still have another pretty big battle to fight in 2020.
So back in 2001 when we had the 50-50 Senate, part of the agreement was that all committees had to have half members from each party. Yeah. And so in that case, Kavanaugh would have never gotten out of committee because the Judiciary Committee would have been evenly divided. So these are things. This is a possibility. This is not a certainty. I would like to stress. I think we've kind of talked the Senate to death, though. Here, maybe.
Yeah, because
Yes.
I think one of the biggest things to take into consideration here is that yes, with like the likely 50-50 Senate, it will slow some Trump stuff down. But the biggest check on his power that we can currently have is the House, which looks way more favorable.
Yeah. So we'll get to that in a minute, but just before we hop off the Senate, keep in mind election day's coming up here real soon. So if you live in any of those states that we mentioned, which I know most of you live in Missouri,
Yes.
make sure you get out. There's still plenty of time to go to your local volunteer office and go try to get out the vote.
Go canvas.
Yeah, push for it. Even if I don't encourage just posting on social media and doing nothing else, but at the very least, just remind your friends to get out and vote.
And also, if we collectively get Taylor Swift to start campaigning like full-fledged for Democrats in Tennessee, I think we have a much better chance of flipping that state.
So that's all it's going to take is go tell your friends to vote and let's get all the celebrities on
Yeah,
board.
we need Taylor Swift. We need Matthew McConaughey, because I know he likes Beto. Those two look way too similar.
What?
Yeah.
No.
Look, pull up a picture,
That's
Brett.
not.
Do it right now.
That's not.
We'll
even,
be back after this ad, everybody.
It's not even slightly.
All right, well, let's go do the. Brett, I would love to accompany you on the podcast.
President Obama, is that you again?
Brett, I'd like to tell you now about the presenting sponsor of the 36% Avian Apparel.
Oh my God, tell me more.
Well, Brett, if you are tired of buying the same mainstream brands of clothing and you're looking for something to elevate your style, Avian Apparel has what you need. Avian aims to provide quality, stylish apparel for those willing to take flight, with a variety of different items, including hats, shirts, hoodies, crew necks, and healthcare. Avian can be your one-stop shop for all of your clothing and medical needs. With a
Mr.
minimalistic...
President, did you say healthcare?
Look, Brett, I bought healthcare to millions of Americans, and Trump is trying to take it away. So, as I said, Avian can be your one-stop shop, Brett, just like Obamacare.gov. With your minimalistic yet bold look, Avian Apparel demonstrates that there is indeed beauty in simplicity and human rights. To see what all the hype is about, check out myavian.com and use the promo code the36 at checkout for 15% off your entire purchase. Again, that is use the code the36 on myavian.com and get yourself 50% off your purchase and 100% off your healthcare. This was
Socialized medicine. Wow, we've really come a long way. Thanks, my avian.
well, Brett, join the flock and take flight and get your health care. Ready?
Yeah.
Welcome back to the pod, everybody.
So, moving on from the Senate, we talked that to death. Let's go to the races that seem much more likely for us to actually have success in this House of Congress, specifically the House of Representatives. So, all polling and all common sense really tells us that Democrats have a fantastic shot at taking it back. That's far from a guarantee, as you know, we're not ones to promise anything by polling and data and everything.
We learned from discredited fraud Nate Silver's experience, shall we say, in 2016.
Yeah.
Oh, man.
Yeah, Nick's been waiting for the past half hour to throw that in there. But, yeah, so, again, most of the polling, most of the data we have so far suggests the Democrat turnout is going to be pretty good, and that we have a really solid chance in most of the races that we desperately need to win. We have just a quick rundown of a couple different states. We have a lot of states that we can look at, but just for those of you who might not be familiar with the Senate, where they have cycles of a third of the Senate's up every election. The House, everyone is up for election every election. So that means that every single House district is up for re-election right now. What that means is Democrats need how many seats to flip?
23.
23. See, Nick, this is why we brought you on here. I knew you were going to know this. By all predictions, it looks like we're set to win about how many?
Like 34?
34? Yeah, in the neighborhood of like 30, 34, 36, I'd say. I'd be comfortable with that assessment.
Yeah.
My current prediction is 40.
Shoot.
Okay.
I was gonna say, I think
Wow.
if turnout is as good as it says it is, we are gonna see, I think, probably about 40.
So just to establish some priors here,
Yeah.
like the Cook Political Report, for those of you who aren't familiar, like there's these ratings agencies like Cook and Sabato and Inside Elections, whatever, that put out these ratings of congressional races, gubernatorial races, all sorts of stuff. You might say, who cares? Well, political
like Nick
nerds,
does.
I care.
We
I
care.
care. These ratings agencies historically have a pretty good record of calling these races.
Yeah.
Not sterling, but pretty good. And so currently, it's called the board, whether a seat or a race is on the board. And currently in the House, Cook has 98 GOP races on the board and only 13 Democratic ones. And what the board means is that it's rated as either a toss-up, lean, or likely, which is kind of an acknowledgement that the race is competitive. And so you have such a mismatch here between the number of Republican seats that are at risk and the Democratic seats at risk that really the map is larger for the Democrats than it has been since probably 2006.
Yeah. So nearly 100 seats the Republicans stand to potentially lose. 13 sitting Democrats potentially sit to lose their seats in the House.
And only like 3 of the Democratic seats are at like toss-up or lean. So
Yeah.
the other 10 are at likely, which means they are more than likely not going to fall.
Right.
So
Yeah.
the map is, and this is ridiculous to me, remembering what congressional elections were like in 2014 and 2016, because the map so clearly favored the Republicans. But just because of our dear friend, our president, Donald Trump, and some missteps, you could say, by the Republican Party, like, say, the Obamacare repeal failed, and tax reform, if we'll call it that.
Well, they did reform tax
Yes.
brackets, just not for any of us.
The map is just gigantic and sprawling, covers a wide variety of territory.
Yeah, and it's funny you say that, actually. From a numbers standpoint, yes, it covers a sprawling amount of territory. From a geographical standpoint,
More of a mixed picture.
yeah, it's more of a mixed bag. I think the areas that we kind of expect to stay Republican, I don't know that there are that many that are genuinely surprising that might be flipping. I say this, I'm going to point to Kansas because at every given opportunity I point to Kansas for these things. So we have the third, which is basically the Kansas City area. The second, which includes Manhattan and Lawrence, which are the 2 big college towns, plus Topeka, which all typically go a little more liberal.
So basically, it's the easternmost fifth of the state.
Right. They're the second, which is or the third, excuse me, which is Kansas City, is pretty much solidly going to go to a Democrat.
Sharice Davis.
Yep, Sharice Davids, yeah. And the second, who's Paul Davis, is a toss-up right now. That's not necessarily surprising.
The center of Brett's heart, Paul Davis.
Yeah, famed Brownback competitor, Brownback defeater.
And so 2014, Kansas gubernatorial election,
Yeah.
competitive race between Sam Brownback, whose tax cuts experiment was going towards disaster.
Yeah, he was
and
Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan before Mitch
and,
McConnell and Paul Ryan were Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan.
Democratic House Minority Leader Paul Davis. And it was a competitive race. Brownback ultimately won, and then Trump had to pull him out of the state and make him some ambassador for religious freedom or something.
Yeah. He was
And
the least popular governor in American history. Managed to get reelected by less than 30,000 votes, which I know sounds like a wide margin, but like I'm still mad about all those numbers before and after the election. But I would almost say that like what happened in Kansas in 2014 and what's happening now is a pretty stark difference to where we actually have some competition in the second and the third. I know the second and the third have gone to Democrats before, but Kansas also went pretty convincingly to Trump.
yeah, and the second is really only competitive because of Paul Davis, which Paul Davis won the second in his failed gubernatorial bid.
Yeah.
And then also because the incumbent Lynn Jenkins is retiring, so it's an open seat.
Right.
The third is competitive because Kevin Yoder is an idiot and has voted like a right-wing hack, even though he's in one of the most competitive districts in the country.
Yep. Yeah.
And what about the fourth, Brett?
The fourth is where I'm from. It houses Wichita plus like the surrounding rural swaths thanks to gerrymandering. James Thompson is running, in my opinion, an absolutely fantastic campaign out there We have a Democratic base that's mobilized in Wichita unlike anything I've ever seen. That being said, Wichita being the biggest city in Kansas is traditionally pretty solid. I would say it's a pretty solid leaning Republican area. I wouldn't say it's confidently Republican. Granted, Kansas as a state hasn't always been confidently Republican. Before Sam Brownback, we had Kathleen Sebelius as a governor, who was A, a woman, which is hard to believe, B, a Democrat, which is even harder to believe, and C, she's a pro-choice female Democrat. And she got reelected twice by overwhelming margins.
Well, we could probably do a whole podcast episode on the weird politics of Kansas.
We really could, and we
But-
should, but we'll leave that
yeah.
for a different time.
Some other, and these Kansas races kind of fall into kind of this category of competitive House seat,
Yeah.
which are these Midwestern battleground seats. Seats where, other than Kansas, because Obama did not do terribly well in Kansas, that Obama did decently well in 2008 and 2012, and the floor kind of fell out for Clinton in 2016.
Yeah.
Notably, all 3 Republican-held seats in Iowa are on the board, as I mentioned earlier. One of which is that toss-up, which is Young's seat, which covers most of Des Moines and kind of the surrounding area, and then Blum's seat, which Iowa the 1st, which the Democrat is considered the favorite to win, Abby Finkenauer, who's a state senator.
Yeah, she's looking very good in the polls currently.
She's had, in pretty much all of the independent polling done, she's had double-digit leads. Blum is kind of infamous for, in 2017 during the Obamacare debacle, was that he had a radio interview in which he was surrounded by children, and when the radio interviewer asked him about his Obamacare vote, he stood up and just left.
Wow.
Yeah,
Good.
so-
Politics at its finest.
And that seat, Iowa 1st, was held by Democrats prior to 2014. So, and that's kind of this trend you'll see, is that these seats are not unfavorable to Democrats. Sorry to use a double negative there, but
They're almost favorable to
and
Democrats.
and Iowa 1st has a large Democratic voter registration margin in terms of party affiliation of voters, and so that these seats are kind of snapping back towards the Democrats in a big way is encouraging, I would say, for 2020. You can't necessarily one-to-one thing. Like, if you look at the 2010 House results, you would say Obama's going to lose, but that ended up not being the case either. The epitaphs written about the Democratic Party in these parts of the country clearly more complicated than that going forward.
Oh, yeah. And so speaking of, Midwest battleground states, we touched on Kansas, we touched on Iowa. Just to give you a quick rundown of the short list that we've built here, we also have the Colorado 3rd, New Mexico 2nd, the Kentucky 6th, and the Utah 4th. And then also we have the Washington 8th, Minnesota 1st, Michigan 7th and 8th, Virginia 5th and 7th. So again, it's a wide smattering of these places in the Midwest. Some typically you wouldn't think would go to Democrats, and some that have been traditional toss-ups that we actually have the pendulum is swung back in our favor.
So, interesting that you mentioned. So, Kentucky 6th, New Mexico 2nd. New Mexico 2nd is an open seat that's being abandoned by Steve Pierce to run for New Mexico governor in a doomed bid. And Kentucky 6th is Andy Barr's seat, which was held by a Democrat prior to 2012. And also with, and some of you might have heard of the West Virginia 3rd race. West Virginia 3 covers coal country in southern West Virginia with Richard Ojeda. These are races where Democrats recruited incredibly good candidates. And in Kentucky 6, you've probably heard of, what is her name? Amy McGrath, who has raised a lot of money, has taken a lead over Barr. And if you're following along on election night, the race that you should most look at to see how the House is going to go will be that Kentucky 6 race, because Kentucky is the first state that closes, along with Indiana, I believe. And keep an eye on that race early in the night, because if Amy McGrath is winning by a lot, it's going to be a good night for Democrats.
Yeah.
And currently the polls are saying that's probably one of the closest House districts. Mm-hmm. That's going to be a really good indication, as Nick said, as to
and if it's close, even if she doesn't win, if it's close, it'll probably still be a good night for Democrats, because that seat is kind of a pretty Republican seat, but that she has made competitive.
I think another really interesting aspect, that the reason we bring up some of these seats is the New Mexico 2nd and the Colorado 3rd are really, really big districts. Mm-hmm. And largely that's good indications of like the rural nature of these places. And so if Democrats are able to take back these giant districts that encompass a lot of rural land here in the West, also even further in Nevada, and then also parts of Minnesota, and as we mentioned, the Kansas second, these places will also be really interesting indications of how the party's message has begun changing from 2016, when it was much more selective and the tent was much smaller, that we are now getting back to our roots, especially here in the Midwest, of the working people, slightly less educated white people that just want good farms, good families, and healthcare.
Oh yeah, we want a government that's going to protect them. And I think that's a great kind of transition point, because we can sit here and talk about all the different candidates, but right now we're seeing the emergence of a Democratic Party that, in my opinion, looks fundamentally different from the Democratic Party we saw in 2016. If for nothing less than in those reasons is we see this emphasis that's kind of getting away from the urban city centers of let's try to attract the most amount of young people, minorities even. The message is becoming a lot more broad. We're seeing success in these rural places. We're seeing success in places where there aren't such highly dense populations of educated white people. Places where we've typically done really well before. We're continuing to do well there, but the message is kind of changing a little bit. Nick, do you have any insight as to why that might be?
So President Obama, when he ran in 2008 and 2012, did very well in these areas. He his coalition that elected and then reelected him kind of married the old kind of line guard Democratic coalition in the Midwest, upper Midwest, like these union workers and white working class people, to the so-called coalition of the ascendant, which is more diverse people in the cities and suburbs, okay? And the Democratic Party, it seems, is doing its darndest in this election to kind of replicate that and bring it back. Clinton had a much narrower focus. She did very well in the suburbs, especially, and that's kind of the other category of House seats we have here, is these suburban seats that Democrats kind of seem to be running away with, in that there's very traditionally Republican-held territory, that, and some of these open seats, like suburban Tucson, suburban New York City, like up into the Hudson Valley or wherever, where Democrats seem to be leading. Mm-hmm. And these races, I mean, any House polling you see, kind of take it with a grain of salt. It's hard to poll a place that only has like 750,000 people. But these suburban seats, like Barbara Comstock's seat in Virginia 10 is probably the Republicans' most terribly lost seat in the country, because the D.C. suburbs are in revolt against them. Yeah. And we saw this in the Virginia governor's race in 2017, and how Democrats picked up a bunch of House of Delegates races in her district. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So things are not looking good for the Republicans, either in the suburbs or kind of in these traditional Democratic areas. And that's kind of like where the House will be won. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, going off of that as well, one of the things that was kind of we're seeing with the Republican Party right now, where they're having a lot of success, or how they've gotten to this place where they've been so successful, rather, is they started to cultivate back in the late 90s, the early aughts, this kind of farm team of young politicians. They began to elevate through state legislatures, through these easily Republican, easily winnable House seats, and now these are the guys that we see in the House and the Senate that have the 15, 20 years of experience coming into some of these races, that are putting up a good fight. And I mean, they're doing the same thing right now with the judicial branch, of where they're just shoving all the young white guys they can on the bench to kind of fill it up. I think where the Democratic Party kind of got hit the hardest in 2016 and leading up to it even, was the Democratic Party doesn't really have a farm team. There aren't, up until that point, there wasn't a whole lot of young, bright, shining stars from the Democratic Party that were ready to take on some of the bigger races.
Well, they will after this year. I can tell you that.
Exactly. Now we're starting to build that.
And a lot of them are going to be women. I think a lot of the stuff you might have noticed, actually, as we've been mentioning the people running in these districts, is the fact that way more of them have been women.
Yeah.
I think almost half of Democratic House nominees this year are women.
Yeah,
that sounds about right to me.
Genuinely, I think,
and it's a much higher percentage in open races where there was no Democrat incumbent. Mm-hmm. So the movement really is towards women, the Democratic Party being the providence of women, and the Republican Party being the providence of men. Yeah. And this is, I don't know if this is good, but this is kind of a trend you have to acknowledge.
This might be the accumulation of ID politics that we've lately been so afraid of. It's the boogeyman is identity politics, but I think that's where we're at. I don't think it's a permanent structure of saying, okay, one party is always going to be the bastion for this group, this party's always going to be the bastion for this group. But when you have a party that, again, since the late 90s, since the mid to late 90s, has made its primary running stance on women's health care and reproductive rights, and the other party that, well, I really don't know what our main winning message is in the Democratic Party, but the Republican Party has mostly made itself this conservative, male-oriented party. And the Democratic Party right now, I think, is finding itself. And, the immediate future of that, I think, is definitely going to be women.
I think a major aspect of this is that back when Bobby Kennedy was running for president, he could take one message and deliver it to a bunch of white union workers, and then take that same message across the city and talk to a lot of impoverished African American voters and not change his message.
Yeah.
And I think that that's something that the Democratic Party is really getting back to. And we mentioned how the Democratic Party really is the big tent party. And a lot of people call it identity politics, but really, when you have a message that that attracts and encompasses the many different demographics, whether they be minorities of any kind, ethnic, religious, that all really that accumulates into having a party that has a really diverse and very attractive message to all types of people, and not just the Republican white middle-aged men and old people that really just want to return this country to the 1950s, by which they all grew up in.
So I think it's interesting to kind of think about what is the Democratic message this year. I think kind of at the center of it you have healthcare, which I think pretty much every House, Senate, gubernatorial campaign is waging the fight on healthcare. Okay, but other than that, you kind of have these different trends. In some areas, you definitely have a lot of candidates talking about corruption and the corruption within the Trump administration. In other areas that's not so much emphasized, you'll have some people who, in certain states like New Jersey and California and New York, who are campaigning against the tax cuts pretty vociferously because those states were disadvantaged by certain kind of provisions in there. And kind of finally, you have some that are running on education, which is kind of surprising to see education come full back around, because I remember when the big education issue was Common Core, Common Core, Common Core. And I've not heard anything about Common Core this year, like maybe not a single word. And
yeah, you're not wrong. And I think that kind of speaks to some of these issues are more regional issues. Like Kansas, education's a big one, but that's because as a result of the Brownback tax scheme, our public education was one of the first things to be cut, and it's just continued to be cut. So it's popular because everyone's like, hey, we need to stop this. I think tax cuts the same thing in places where they're getting hurt more.
These kind of local issues really come to the forefront in the gubernatorial races that are kind of raging across this country. For those that aren't familiar, most governorships are elected kind of in the off-year midterm. There's historical reasons for why that's the case, but there's some interesting gubernatorial races to look at. Kansas is one of them. Michigan, I think, is very interesting. Florida is very interesting. Nearby in Illinois, that race is interesting in so much as it's uninteresting.
Right.
Because,
I haven't heard anything about
because
it.
Bruce Rauner is just losing. Republican incumbent governor of Illinois is just losing in a landslide because everyone hates him.
So why is what's-his-face spending so much money then?
Sometimes people just get this.
Running so much money.
You got better be safe than sorry, I guess. It's Illinois. What can you say?
You're not wrong.
But Michigan is interesting because it looks like the Republicans have held the governorship of Michigan for the last 8 years. They, of course, poisoned the city of Flint with lead through the city manager that was a Republican idea, and city administrator, I guess. And the current Republican governor is unpopular. Rick Schneider and Gretchen Whitmer, who was kind of panned during the primary as kind of this uninspired candidate, has double-digit leads over the Republican. And this is like a state that Trump won by like half a point, probably the closest state, one of the closest states in the country, other than like maybe New Hampshire. And the Democrats are kind of blowing it out, and they look like they're going to retake the legislature there possibly, and that nonpartisan redistricting amendment is going to pass there, and it's like total disaster for the Republicans in Michigan.
Yeah, and just to quickly go over the polls there, Whitmire is polling currently with a shared vote of almost 54%, and with the Republican polling in at about 34%.
Yeah.
So we have giant leads there, which is really great.
And this is in a number of states where you have, because Michigan, Wisconsin, and we can talk about the Wisconsin gubernatorial election, but Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Ohio, these are states that have incumbent Democratic senators that are cruising to re-election, despite the fact that these states were won by Donald Trump in 2016. Republicans nominated some dud candidates against them. I've heard the Jim Renacci, who is running against Sherrod Brown in Ohio, has been described as Ed Fitzgerald with a driver's license. And for those who are not familiar, Ed Fitzgerald was the Democrat candidate for governor in Ohio in 2014, who was notably arrested in a car with a prostitute. So if that tells you a little bit, and that was a Republican describing Jim Renacci. So that's kind of telling you candidate quality on the Republican side is not so high in many of these races.
No.
And before we get into some other races here, Nick, I actually have an important question for you. Because as I've been looking at a lot of these polls and such, and a lot of this coming up, places in New England like Vermont, New Hampshire, and Connecticut, Massachusetts, they oftentimes have Republican governors, yet the state, all those states have Democratic senators and a majority House, in Democratic held seats. Yet, how do they keep winning these governorships?
Well, there's a very strong Republican tradition in New England. Like, FDR never won Vermont or Maine. Like, those are the only two states he never won. And so I actually don't even know if LBJ won Vermont and Maine. So, like, New England coming over to the Democratic Party is kind of a recent thing, and Republicans are still strong there. The notable thing in Vermont and Massachusetts, the incumbent governors are extremely moderate. Charlie Baker is probably the most left-wing Republican elected to office in this country, and less so in New Hampshire, but New Hampshire is much more of a swing state. Yeah. And I think it's very unusual, and Vermont and New Hampshire have this weird thing where the governor's elected every 2 years. So these guys were just elected in 2016. It's unlikely that they'll lose this year, but in 2 years from now, I think you're more likely to see stiffer opposition to them.
Yeah, and also, Brett and I on our first episode of this podcast talked about why third-party candidates could not exist in SMDP systems. And this is actually a really great example of it as well, because currently in Vermont, you have Phil Scott, who's the Republican. He's polling at only slightly over 51% of the vote, and with the Democrat polling at about 39%, which leaves about 10% of the entire vote up to these independent candidates. And so, if you by chance you are one of those candidates listening to this podcast, please for God's sake drop out.
Yeah, I mean we're seeing the same thing. This is the Kansas race. It's a 50-50 if you take Greg Orman out. Unfortunately, he's taken about 10% of the vote.
And Greg Orman ran for Senate in 2014. Democrats kind of cleared the way and did not run a candidate against him.
We didn't have a candidate to run against him.
But he has betrayed the Democratic Party who supported him in his run in 2014.
Surprise. So, what do we take away from all this? We have an election coming up in about 10 days. We have a pretty convincing lead in the House as of right now. The Senate, anything could happen potentially. The governorships, anything could happen. Yeah. We've talked a lot about a lot of these races. We've said a lot of names out there. We've said a lot of states and a lot of districts. But is there any kind of final thoughts you guys have on this as we get into what could potentially be the next definitive 2 years of our lives?
Democrats are going to clean up. They're going to win seats in places you don't expect. There's going to be upsets that you don't see coming. They're going to make massive gains in the state legislatures and governor's mansions. Yeah. That's my takeaway.
Yeah, I think that come election night, because you guys aren't going to hear from Brett and I until election night, when we'll do a special episode covering the midterms. But I think the places to look for and the things to watch out for, the Nevada gubernatorial race, I think is going to be really telling. How Kansas ends up going. The Georgia gubernatorial race is giant. And Brett and I talked about that a bit on the last podcast, but that one's really important, and will really show how strong Democrats turn out there. As we mentioned, the Kentucky 6th is going to be a really good indication.
Florida.
Florida's a big one.
And then Missouri. I think the Missouri Senate race is going to be really telling, too.
The thing is, you might go into the day after Election Day and things might not be super clear, simply because California, take so goddamn long to count their
It
votes
does.
because their absentee ballots just like flood in after election day. So Democrats could come out like and end up winning 5 additional seats in the House in California after election day. So don't necessarily, if on election night Democrats aren't leading all over California, don't despair necessarily. But yeah, really, the Kentucky 6 race will be kind of your first indicator in the night of where things are headed.
Yeah. So there's still plenty of time to get out there, go knock on some doors, go make some phone calls, tell your friends to vote, get just anybody to vote, really. Don't forget to send in your absentee ballots if you've got them. Just, let's not fuck this up this time, y'all.
Go vote. It's what we can do. Also, Greg Orman, please drop out.
Yeah. So, without further ado, we'll see y'all on election night.
The 36% was founded, written, and directed by Adam Childers Arnold and Brett Combs.
Music in this episode is provided by Purple Planet. Check them out at purple-planet.com.
Music editing by Burnt Crumbs.
The presenting sponsor of the 36% is Avian Apparel.
Our ukulele muse is Adam California.
Our cover art is by the one and only Christian Ferguson.
Thanks so much to Nicholas Eberly for joining us on the podcast today.
Thank you so much for tuning in this week.
And this has been
The 36%.